Well, thank you guys. That was great. They said in first service it was kind of grand old Opry morning here. Well, when I was in high school, one of my sports heroes was the great Steve Largent. Steve played for the Seahawks from 1976 through 1989. His entire 14-year NFL career was spent with the Seahawks. And when he retired, he held all of the records that a receiver could hold. He had the most receptions in a career up to that point, 819. He had the most yards received in a career, 13,089 yards. He had the most touchdown receptions by a receiver, 100, and he was the first receiver to ever do that. And he had a record of 177 consecutive regular season games in which he received a pass. A few years ago, I had a chance to go to a banquet where Steve was going to be the featured keynote speaker. And so I was really excited because this is like one of my, heroes of my youth going to be there. And one of the things I love about Steve is that not only was he a great football player, but he is also a follower of Jesus. And he's always been very outspoken about his faith. So I was excited to go to this banquet, and it was at a big hotel over in Bellevue. And we got there a little bit early. Burnett and I went, and I'm kind of hoping, I'm sort of wandering around the lobby, like maybe I'll run into Steve, And I look around this corner down a hallway, and I can see there's a big black curtain blocking off one end of the hall, but you can kind of see around the curtain. And I look around, and there behind the curtain is Steve. And Steve is talking to people. But I figure out real quick that these are the special people. These are like the VIP people, the big donors. And I was not one of the big donors. So I'm kind of dejected. I'm heading back down to be with all the regular people. And I pass this lady in the corridor, and she's got a very official-looking name badge on, and she says, "Can I help you with anything?" I said, I just, I thought it'd be fun if, Steve was around, but I know he's back there. And she goes, "Oh, yeah, that's the VIP section, And she says, "But would you like me to take you back?" Sure. Can my wife come? Sure, go get her. So I got to meet Steve Largent. It was really cool, right? Now, I was reminded of an important lesson that evening. And the lesson is, it doesn't matter so much what you have as it matters who you're with. In John 6, I think we see Jesus teaching his disciples this lesson as well. That as we move through life, we may run up against situations where we don't have the resources. We don't have what it takes to accomplish what needs to be done, but what really matters isn't what we have. It is who we are with. So let's take a look at John chapter 6, the first 4 verses. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now we get a little bit of setting here. We find out that Jesus is up on this mountainside, so they are out away from everything. And there is a large crowd that has gathered around him. This large crowd is there in part because Passover is near. People are gathering from all over, and there is a lot of religious fervor and excitement as they're preparing for this major holy day in the Jewish calendar. We also find out here that Jesus has been doing a lot of miracles, and people are excited about that. They have seen sick people made well right in front of their eyes. And so there's a lot of excitement going on around that. But we also find out that these people, while they are spiritually excited and interested, they also have a very real physical need, and that is they're hungry. It's about mealtime, and where they're at, up here on this mountainside, there aren't a lot of street vendors hanging around up there. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, well, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? I love how Jesus sort of nonchalantly looks up and says to his disciples, so where are we going to buy a meal for these folks? Now, for us today, that might not be a super big challenge as long as you had a credit card and Costco, right? You can feed a lot of people pretty quick. Even if you don't have the cash on you, you can just pay it off over time. But for these guys, they didn't have any of those resources. They're on a mountainside. There's no Costco anywhere nearby. And even if there was, we find that Philip, the accountant, he makes this observation that even if that was available, it would take 200 denarii. Or if you were to read the New International Version, it quantifies that as 8 months of wages just to get them Costco samples, let alone the full Costco meal deal. Now, Andrew, he is more of a talent scout. He looks around, says, okay, there's got to be something around here we can do. What have we got? What have we got? And he goes, well, I've got this kid here, and he's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But that doesn't really seem like enough. In fact, the NIV, I love how it does this translation. It points out that there was a great crowd, but that the boy had small barley loaves and small fish. Big problem, little tiny resources. John is the latest of the gospel accounts written. We've talked about this before. It is more meditative and devotional than the other 3 gospels. I think what we have here is an elderly man, John, who reflects back on life. Reflects back specifically on his life with Jesus, his friend, his master. And from that perspective, he reflects on this thing that, you know what, I think Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He asked this question, but in a sense, this wasn't an honest question. It wasn't because Jesus was at a loss as to what to do. He wanted his disciples to actually think about this problem, but he already knew what he was going to do. Of the gospel writers, and all 4 of them record this incident, this miracle, John is the only one that points this out. He's the only one that looks back and thinks it through from the perspective of, you know, this really was a test of faith. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. Matthew and Mark, they mention that Jesus had compassion on the crowd. But John reflects back and says, you know, that was another one of those setups of faith that Jesus seemed to love to do to us over and over again. And we fell for it every time, like gullible people that never get the joke. My mom, love her, wonderful lady, my brother and I could just pull her leg mercilessly. It would take her like half an hour, and she'd finally say, you boys are doing it again, aren't you? Yeah, Mom. Have been for about 20 years now, you know? These guys are kind of like that. Jesus keeps setting them up, and they keep falling for him, going, I don't know what to do. And Jesus already knew. I'm one of those people. How about you? God has put me in situations throughout my life where I look at my resources and I go, I don't have what it takes. I don't know what to do. And even though I have watched God work over and over again, I meet the test again, and once again I get just as confounded as I was the last time, as though there's no answer here. And yet Jesus already knows what he's going to do. Because it is not what you have. It's who you're with. Well, so Jesus takes charge. He says, have the people sit down. Now, there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So they didn't have very much food, but they did have a lot of grass. It's interesting, Jesus gets everyone seated before he starts doing anything. I think he probably wanted to avoid a riot. I had a chance a few years ago to be in Central America, and we were going to board an airline. Now, everyone has tickets. We all have assigned seats, all right? So if you're in the waiting area, you know that you are going to get on the plane in your assigned seat. In Central America, that's not how they process loading instructions. The lady at the counter tried to say we're going to load rows number whatever it was through 100 first. Everybody hits the door as though it's the last flight out of Vietnam. I mean, it's just nuts. People are pushing and clawing and trying to get on. It's like, you guys, we're all going to get on the plane. There's no need. I think Jesus was afraid this crowd, if they saw what he was about to do, were going to do one of those kinds of rush the rabbi sorts of things. So he gets them all sat down first. Reminds me of Psalm 23. It says that the good shepherd, he makes me to lie down in green pasture. And I think that sometimes Jesus waits for us to sit down. We get so anxious. We're so intense. We know exactly what we need. We're sure we know what we need. We're sure we know what God has to do. And we're pushing against those doors, and we're trying to get it for ourselves. And it's as though God is saying, would you just sit down? Would you just wait for me? I have the answer. I'll provide for your need, but just sit down. Jonathan Aiken was a one-time member of the Prime Minister's cabinet in Great Britain. Here's an observation he made. Throughout my career, I had been in one long, energetic rush to set agendas, achieve targets, make deliveries ahead of schedule, claim the first past the post winner's bonus, and then accelerate ahead to the next milestone. This style of existence had been exciting, but ultimately unfulfilling. Gradually, I came to recognize that if I wanted it to mean anything at all in the spiritual domain of God's work, that could only be started when the fever of impatience had been conquered. Ever been the victim of the fever of impatience? When you're sitting where Jesus wants you, your needs will be met. I was thinking back on just stories that have occurred in my life, and I was thinking to, when I had started my business, I started off as a medical equipment broker. So that means that doctors, hospitals, whoever called me said, hey, we're looking for this piece of equipment, or we got this piece to sell. And then I know lots of dealers and other people, and I put the things together. And that was fine, except that the internet was becoming a bigger and bigger reality, and I realized that the days of the pure broker were probably numbered, because we kind of were the Google. You know, you call us, we knew where stuff was, but the day was coming that anybody could find everything. And you needed to be in a position where you could actually control the inventory. And at that moment, it's like God just dropped something in my lap. Like God calls me, says, hey, there's a company here. It's a good business model. They actually control the assets for hospitals and resell them for them. They're having some trouble with some management issues, but I think there's a chance for you to buy this company. Brenda and I prayed about it. Really felt like this was something God had just brought to us. And it was exciting, but it was a little intimidating. It was bigger than I was sure I could handle. But I proceeded over the next 12 months, almost 18 months, to try and make this deal happen. Feeling like this was something God was leading me to, but at the same time, there were some big obstacles. And it got really stressful. The farther I got into it, the more players there were that felt that they had a vested interest in how this transaction should happen. And everybody was convinced that they should be paid a gold mine for what they had. And there was no way that any of that could happen. A, it wasn't worth it, and B, I didn't have it. And I felt my frustration rising, and I felt like I'm pushing, and then it was kind of like God just said, Tim, would you just sit down? Would you just quit pushing and trust me? And I finally had to say, okay, Lord, I don't understand, but if that means I just have to let go of this, I can let go of it. It's okay. And so I completely walked away from the deal. Kind of confused. Not sure why all that work had gone in for nothing. 6 months went by. Didn't hear a thing. I figured that's all over and gone. Late one afternoon, I get a phone call. One of the principals calls me up and he says, are you still interested? And I was able to say with absolute peace, no, I'm not. Which is a great place to be in when you're making a deal. You know, it was amazing. The way that worked out, the months I had spent prior to that working on this, I actually knew a whole lot about this company. And in about 3 minutes, I made them an offer that I never, ever would have made 18 months before that. But I made the offer, and they said, well, we'll have to think about that. And I'm praying that they'll say no. They called back an hour later, and they said, yes, we'll do it. Never would I have thought that that could have happened. But it didn't happen until I finally reached a point where I was willing to let go and say, Lord, if this is what you have for me, you're going to have to work out these details. I'm going to stop pushing for this. Now, sometimes God takes things away and they don't come back. That's no promise. But if we reach the point we can say, Lord, I am willing to trust you and to let go of this fever of impatience that says I have to have what I want, I have to have it now, and give God time to work. Well, we find out that Jesus is also a thankful son. It says that Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks. Interesting thing is that in all four gospel accounts, while they recount a few details differently, every one of them makes the point of saying that Jesus did the miracle after he gave thanks. It was the provision from the Father through the Son to the people. And you'll note that God did not radically alter what the little boy had. He just multiplied its effect. I'm convinced that God delights in using small things to bless and confound the great. I don't know what you have. You may look at your own gifts and you think, I don't have much. There really isn't anything that I can offer that would be useful for God. I don't think that little boy with his lunch thought to himself, man, I have got what it takes to take care of these people here. That was not the thought going through his head as he was walking up the mountain that afternoon. I told the story first service. Rich Sill, you here? Because I didn't ask your permission, and that's just too bad. A few years ago, Rich, who is retired from law enforcement, had an opportunity to go to Mexico with some other guys that were from law enforcement. And what they did was they took all of their training, and they were training cops in Mexico. Now, they take down handcuffs and rubber guns for practice and stuff, and you think, well, what does that have to do with the gospel? Well, all of these ex-cops were believers in Christ. And they went in and they showed these guys how to be safe and how to do better arrests and better techniques, but also they took that opportunity to share their faith. Now, some of those guys, I think 400 guys came to their workshop. Some of those guys just went back with better skills for law enforcement. But there were a bunch of them that went back with a newfound relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think when Rich first started learning how to be an officer, he thought to himself, man, is this going to be a great tool for the gospel? But you see, if we take whatever it is that God has given to us, and we offer it up to him and say, Lord, here it is. Here's what I've got. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a couple of dead fish, but they're your dead fish. And if you want to do something with them, they're available to you. God can do great things because it's not about what you have. It's who you're with. Well, we find that he is an abundant provider. He gave thanks, and then he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. You know, it tells me that Jesus cares about our spiritual needs, but he does care about our physical needs as well. And he made sure that these people didn't just have a little bit to stave off hunger. It says that they were full, that they were satisfied. Matthew 15:32, Matthew recording this, Jesus' words are, I have compassion on these people. Here's a question for you. Why did Jesus have the disciples collect the extra? I don't have a Bible verse for this. It's just something you kind of ponder. Why did they pick up all the extra bread? Well, I think that one reason may be that what he desires is our dependence on him and not complacency. If you take this back to the Old Testament, the story of Moses with the children of Israel in the wilderness and the miracle of the manna. Remember the manna? This substance that they would find every morning where there was nothing to eat and God provided miraculously for them and they could collect. And he said, only collect enough for the day. If you try to collect more, it's going to rot. Except the day before the Sabbath. The day before the Sabbath, you could collect 2 days' worth, so you didn't have to work on the day of rest. But there was to be this sense among God's people of dependence on God day by day to meet their needs. And not the idea of hoarding and hogging and keeping for myself and somehow trying to secure my future with everything that I can grab. It was to live in a relationship of dependence. Not of want, not of being stingy. I think there also was this idea of stewardship. That the gifts not be wasted. When he says, I don't want this wasted, I have a feeling that probably they found other people that they gave the rest of it to. That it was all put to use. And I think that Jesus probably wanted to avoid turning this bread into some sort of relic. We do that, don't we? We grab that stuff and we make an idol out of it. I mean, can you imagine what people could have done with some of this bread? Took it home, make a little shrine somewhere in the living room with the magic bread. You know, begin to pray to the magic bread because maybe it still had some of the power that was in it when Jesus divined. Jesus says, we're not going to do any of that. Pick up all of that stuff. Because it's not what you have. It's not what you can hang on to. It's who you're with. And then we find that Jesus was a prayerful servant. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. The crowd's pretty excited. I mean, they've heard his teaching, and they are impressed with his teaching. They have seen him perform miracles. The sick have been raised, but now they've watched him take 5 little bits of bread and 2 little fish and feed thousands of people. If they were thinking about the Old Testament, they might have thought of Elijah and the widow who was out of food. And the miracle happens where this little container of oil just keeps producing oil. And they must be thinking, this must be Elijah. Or they're thinking about Moses and the manna that he gave to the people, and this could be the great deliverer that God has brought to us. I mean, politicians promise all kinds of things, right? And yet here's someone who's not even running for office that really can make sure that there is food in every cupboard, lemonade in every drinking fountain, and free health care for all. Who doesn't want to vote for this guy? And they begin to think, how can we just put him on the ballot? They're going to come and take him by force. And yet we find that Jesus refuses. Says it's the wrong time. It's the wrong place. It's the wrong motive. And what you want me to be king of is the wrong kingdom. Jesus will never be coerced to satisfy our agendas. There's a difference between God choosing to show his power through the weak who come to him in faith versus the weak trying to manipulate his power to their own ends. Jesus was always careful about who he allowed to make him king. He didn't want a shallow, fickle, popular vote that was based on promises of bread in every basket and free health care. He would only accept the crown from his Father when his work had been accomplished. See, we don't make Jesus king. He is the king. Our choice is whether or not we will submit our lives to him. So how does Jesus respond? Well, we find that he withdraws to be alone, to get away from the crowd. He has this sense of his Father's timing, his Father's plan, and he goes away to pray to refresh himself with his Father. Because prayer is the way that we find God's pace in life. Here's a question for you. Was Jesus, the man, ever tempted to succumb to his popularity with the crowds? I find this is a concept a lot of people struggle with, to say, was Jesus ever really tempted? I mean, we know that Satan tempted in the wilderness, but I think most of us think that it was kind of a pretend temptation. Jesus, because he was God, yeah, sure, there was kind of temptation, but he wasn't really tempted. But Jesus experienced life as a man. And while maybe we all are tempted by different things, what is tempting to me may not be tempting to you at all. But we all face temptation. I've never been tempted to be king of the world. Well, not for long. Because I know that is way outside of my realm. It wasn't outside of Jesus' realm. He really did have what it takes to be the king of the world. And the temptation comes to him, you could have it all without the cross. Isn't that how Satan came to Jesus? Luke chapter 4, we have that experience of Jesus in the wilderness and Satan coming to him. And it's interesting that once again the issue of bread comes up. Remember that? Jesus has been hungry. And Satan says, well, hey, here's some rocks. You could turn the rocks into bread. You could take care of it. And Jesus says, no, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And then Satan says, if you would just worship me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. I will make you king. And no cross required. That's how temptation comes to us, isn't it? Temptation promises us good things that we want, but it offers them to us via a shortcut, via a route that we're not supposed to take, but it looks like it's going to save us struggle. It's going to save us time. It's going to save us sacrifice. That's what makes it tempting. We like the goal. The question is, how do we get there? It says that when Satan was done tempting Jesus there in the wilderness, it says that he left him until an opportune time. He recognized that, well, maybe you're strong right now, but I know that what I'm suggesting is tempting. I'm going to come back later. I'm going to offer it to you again when I think maybe you'd be more susceptible to it. Maybe this is one of those times. Suddenly the crowds, thousands of them, are ready to make you king. All you have to say is okay, and they will do it for you. And so Jesus pulls away from that influence. Chuck Swindoll used to say, don't believe your own press. When I was in the Ukraine, I met a guy there. His name was Chris. Wonderful musician. He was a 2-time Grammy-nominated musician here in the United States, had performed for years, had been at the zenith of a musical career as we would see it. And it was in that point that he also realized that there was really nothing undergirding his life. And at a point of brokenness, he came to Christ. And we were talking about that whole experience and how he had decided to leave that life behind, and now he's living in Ukraine and ministering there, and what it was like living in that world with all the fame and all the acclaim. And he said, Tim, man is not made to have thousands of people screaming your name. It messes with you. I wonder if it messed with Jesus a little bit to have all those people so excited, so wanting you, so telling you how wonderful you are, and they'll follow you anywhere. And was there a little genuine temptation as the devil whispered in his ear, you can have it all right now, and no cross? And Jesus says, I need to leave here. I need to go away and be with my Father, away from all the people, away from all the noise, away from all the temptation, and be in tune with the pace of my Father. There's probably a model for us when we face temptation. It's not what we have, it's not who is shouting our name, it's who we are with, who we are following. Well, then we find out that he is a powerful Savior. John chapter 6, verse 16, we find out the disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat and started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So Jesus is away having a quiet time with his Father, but the disciples, meanwhile, back at the ranch, or the fishing boat, as it may be, are having a pretty different experience. They are caught in this storm at sea. They are a long ways from shore. They're exhausted. They're alone. And as far as they can tell, the one person that could save them is a long ways away. And there's no way he's going to get to them because they're out in the middle of the water now and he's way back there on the mountain. Life is like that sometimes, isn't it? You have those mountaintop experiences that are just so wonderful, so amazing. God is so close. You feel so good. And then it seems like the very next minute you're plunged into the depths of it. And then the storm is raging and you're thinking, God, where'd you go? I'm lost here. There's no way out of this. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. I guess they were. Conventional wisdom dictates that if you aren't on the boat when it leaves the dock, you're not going to be with the crew on the journey. They weren't expecting anybody to come walking out on the water there. Sailors tend to be a bit superstitious even in the best of times. These guys are pretty sure they're seeing some kind of ghost. But Jesus says to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. You know, Jesus didn't make a regular practice of walking on water. You don't see him just whenever he wants to go someplace, just kind of go walking across the waves. He usually got in the boat and rode with the disciples. But this time, he comes walking on the water because he knew that they were lost without him. And he came to find them. Now, they still had to invite him into the boat. But he knew where they were, even in the storm, and he came looking for them. Jesus can show up when he is least expected, and he can deliver us when all of our resources are gone. I told you about Jonathan Aiken. There's more to Jonathan Aiken's story. I said that Jonathan was at one time a part of the prime minister's cabinet. That's true, but he eventually lost that position because he was caught up in a lie that he told in court. He was convicted of perjury. In the midst of all of the chaos surrounding that court case, though, Jonathan met Jesus Christ and became a follower of Jesus. That didn't make the trial go away. In fact, Jonathan was sentenced to prison. He got to know another politician, an American politician, who too had been part of a cabinet, part of President Nixon's cabinet, who also had been caught up in political intrigue, who also had been convicted for his crimes, who also had met Jesus in the process, and who also had served his time in prison. You probably know him, Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson became a friend of Jonathan Aiken's, and here is what Chuck wrote to Jonathan. As he knew Jonathan was going to go to prison, he said, "It all depends on whether through this experience you come to trust totally and completely in Christ. As you know, I have come to look back on Watergate and thank God for it. Through the crucible, I came to know Christ personally and discovered that in the darkest moments of my life, he was working to produce what I would later see as the greatest blessings of my life." Sometimes in the middle of the storm, we don't understand what God is doing, and it feels like everything is a loss. And like Chuck says, he had learned that what for him felt like the greatest loss of his life, he now could look back and see how God had worked through it for blessing. It's not what you have. It's who you're with. I said there were 2 questions that the text confronts us with. The first is, who is Jesus? He's a master teacher, a thankful son, an abundant provider, a prayerful servant, a powerful savior. The second question, though, is, are you persuaded? Will you trust him? John said that he wrote his gospel so that we would believe, and that in believing we would have life in his name. The Apostle Paul understood this lesson. Philippians chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, he says, "I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. 2 Timothy, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. Paul could look at his life and he could say, I've learned something. Not just in the good times, not just in the times when I'm up on the hillside and it's sunny and my tummy is full and everything is going good, but I've been on the other side of that equation when I was hungry, when I was in prison, when I was in want and in need, but I've learned something through it all, and that is he can be trusted. And I know who I've believed in. And I'm persuaded that he is able to keep what I've committed to him against that day, whether in the easy times or the hard. I love a quote from Beth Moore. She was talking about Daniel's friends who went through that story of the fiery furnace. She says, sometimes God delivers us from the fire, sometimes in the fire, and sometimes through the fire. You know, Wall Street is always a wild ride. People trying to make a buck trading stocks. And the scariest people are the day traders. Day traders every day are trying to find that little profit margin and flip it fast and make the win. And they're very stressed people because they live that way. I heard one investor who had lived through a stock market crash, and he boasted, he said, that he hadn't lost a single dollar in the crash. And someone asked him how that was possible because the market had tanked so badly. And he said, I didn't sell when the stocks were down. Faith is like that. We go through the highs and we go through the lows, and sometimes we go through the low and we're like day traders, we start selling like mad. You know, God's not going to come through. He's not going to provide, and we get caught up in that impatience of I've got to fix this. I've got to somehow find the right trade. I've got to take it all on myself. And I think Jesus says, will you trust me? Don't sell out. Trust me. Because it's not about what you have. It's all about who you're with. Amen?